The purple ocean of Valora Prime stretched endlessly toward the horizon, its waves crashing against the crystal cliffs with a sound like breaking glass, and Sergeant Jake Callahan had never seen anything quite so alien in all his years of military service. He had been stationed on this world for 3 months now, serving as part of the joint diplomatic security team that protected the human outpost nestled between the floating cities of the Valorian Empire. And he still could not get used to the strange beauty of this place. The sky above him churned with dark clouds as a massive storm rolled in from the western sea, and Jake quickened his pace along the cliff patrol route, knowing that Valorian storms were nothing to take lightly. Rain began to fall in heavy sheets, turning the rocky path slippery and dangerous, and the wind howled so loudly that Jake could barely hear his own thoughts as he made his way toward the shelter of the outpost walls. Heard it. A sound cut through the storm, a cry of pure terror and despair that made Jake stop in his tracks, despite the rain pelting his face, and he turned toward the cliff edge, with his heart pounding in his chest. He could see nothing at first, only the churning purple water far below, and the white foam of waves crashing against jagged rocks. But then the cry came again, and Jake spotted movement in the water. Something was struggling down there, fighting against the current with desperate energy, and Jake grabbed his binoculars to get a better look at whatever creature had found itself trapped in that deadly sea. What he saw made his breath catch in his throat. It was a Korath, one of the legendary companion animals that the Valorian nobility prized above almost everything else in their vast empire. And this one was drowning right before his eyes. The creature looked like a lion from Earth, but with 6 powerful legs instead of 4, shimmered in shades of brilliant blue even through the storm and the rain. And it was young, perhaps equivalent to a lion cub of 2 years old. Jake could see chains wrapped around its legs, weighing it down and pulling it beneath the surface again and again as it fought to keep its head above water. And around its neck was a heavy collar that glinted with gold and jewels. Someone had done this deliberately. Someone had chained this beautiful creature and thrown it into the sea to die. Jake did not hesitate for even a single second, and he was already pulling out his rappelling gear before his conscious mind had finished processing what he intended to do. His radio crackled with the voice of his commanding officer asking for his status report. But Jake ignored it as he secured his line to a sturdy rock formation and began his descent down the cliff face. The rocks were slick with rain and covered in strange alien moss that made every handhold treacherous. And twice, Jake nearly lost his grip and plummeted to the rocks below, but he kept going because he could still hear that creature crying out for help. He reached the bottom of the cliff and found himself standing on a narrow ledge of rock, barely wide enough for his boots, with the freezing purple water surging around his ankles and threatening to drag him into the depths. The Korath was only 20 meters away now, and Jake could see the exhaustion in its golden eyes as it struggled to stay afloat, and he knew that the creature had only minutes left before its strength gave out completely. Jake dove into the water. The cold hit him like a physical blow, driving the air from his lungs and making his muscles seize up with shock. But he forced himself to keep swimming toward the drowning animal with powerful strokes. The Korath saw him coming and thrashed in panic, its claws slashing through the water dangerously close to Jake's face. Those golden eyes that told Jake the creature understood he was trying to help. Jake reached the Korath and grabbed onto the chains that were dragging it down, pulling out his combat knife and sawing at the metal links with all his strength, while the waves crashed over both of them again and again. The chains were thick and strong, designed to hold a creature far more powerful than any earth animal, and Jake's arms burned with effort as he worked to cut through them, one link at a time. The Korath stopped thrashing and went still, its golden eyes fixed on Jake's face, with an expression that seemed almost like trust, and that gave Jake the strength to keep going, even as his own body began to fail in the freezing water. One chain broke free and sank into the depths below, then another, and another. Finally, Jake cut through the last chain, holding the weighted collar around the creature's neck, and the Korath suddenly rose higher in the water, able to keep itself afloat without the terrible weight dragging it down. But the young creature was too exhausted to swim to shore on its own, and Jake could see that it was on the verge of losing consciousness as its head began to slip beneath the surface. Jake wrapped his arm around the Korath's massive body and began swimming toward the rocky ledge, kicking with all his remaining strength while the creature hung limply against him. It took him 15 minutes to cover 20 meters, and by the time Jake dragged himself and the Korath onto the rocks, he was so exhausted that he could barely move. But he forced himself to keep going, because the creature was shivering violently and its breathing was shallow and weak, and Jake knew that it would die of hypothermia if he did not act quickly. He pulled off his thermal blanket and wrapped it around the Korath, rubbing the creature's blue fur vigorously to generate warmth, and holding it close to his own body, despite the exhaustion that made his arms feel like lead. The Korath opened its golden eyes and looked up at Jake, and something passed between them in that moment that Jake would never be able to explain in words. It was gratitude and trust and something deeper, a bond forming between two souls who had nothing in common except this single moment of shared survival. Jake picked up the Korath in his arms, marveling at how light the creature felt despite its size, and began the long climb back up the cliff face with his precious burden held close to his chest. The storm raged around them, but Jake did not stop, placing one foot in front of the other with grim determination, until finally he reached the top of the cliff and saw the lights of the human outpost shining through the rain. He staggered through the gates, with the Korath still wrapped in his blanket, ignoring the shocked stares of the guards and the shouted questions from his fellow soldiers. The creature straight to the medical bay and laid it gently on examination table, and only then did he allow himself to collapse into a chair beside it. A medic rushed over and began checking Jake for injuries, but Jake waved her away and pointed at the Korath instead. "Help the lion first," he said, and those were the last words he spoke before exhaustion finally claimed him and he slipped into unconsciousness. When Jake woke up several hours later, he found the Korath curled up on the floor beside his bed, its golden eyes watching him with an expression of pure devotion. Jake smiled and reached down to scratch the creature behind its ears, and the Korath made a deep rumbling sound that vibrated through the floor like a purr. "I think I will call you Leo," Jake said softly, and the Korath pressed its head against his hand as if in agreement. Neither of them knew that this moment would change the course of galactic history, or that forces were already at work, moving, that would try to tear them apart. All they knew was that they had found each other in the storm, and that was enough. 3 days had passed since Jake pulled the Korath from the freezing waters of the Purple Sea, and in that time, Leo had not left his side for even a single moment. The creature followed Jake everywhere he went, patting silently on 6 powerful legs, and watching everything with those intelligent golden eyes that seemed to understand far more than any animal should. The human medical staff had examined Leo thoroughly and declared him healthy despite his ordeal in the water, though they marveled at the deep bond that had already formed between the soldier and the beast. Jake spent every free moment with Leo, teaching him simple commands and playing with him in the courtyard of the outpost, while other soldiers watched in amazement at the sight of a battle-hardened sergeant wrestling with a blue-furred alien lion. But the peaceful days could not last forever. Commander Lisa Morgan called Jake into her office on the 4th morning, and the look on her face told him immediately that something was very wrong. She was a tall woman, with short gray hair and eyes that had seen too many difficult decisions, and she gestured for Jake to sit down, before speaking in a voice heavy with concern. "We have a problem," she said, and then she turned her computer screen so that Jake could see what was displayed there. It was a security recording from a luxury yacht, the kind that only the wealthiest Valorians could afford. And Jake watched with growing horror as the scene unfolded before his eyes. A young Valorian woman stood on the deck of the yacht, her purple skin marking her as nobility, and her elaborate robes indicating that she was someone of tremendous importance. In her arms, she held her young Korath, the same one that now waited for Jake outside the commander's office, and she was laughing as she showed the creature off to a group of admiring friends. But then the recording jumped forward in time, and the woman's expression had changed completely, twisted now with rage and disgust, as she held up a torn gown and pointed at a small scratch on her arm. Jake watched as she screamed at her servants and ordered them to chain the Korath. And when they hesitated, she grabbed the chains herself and wrapped them around the creature's legs with vicious satisfaction. The final image showed her throwing the chained Korath over the side of the yacht, her face lit with cruel amusement as she watched it sink beneath the waves. Jake felt his hands curl into fists as the recording ended, and he had to take several deep breaths before he could trust himself to speak. "Who is she?" he asked, though he already suspected the answer would make everything much more complicated. Commander Morgan sighed and rubbed her temples before answering. "That is Princess Selvira of House Kalon, third daughter of the Valorian High Emperor, and one of the most powerful people in this quadrant of the galaxy." Jake closed his eyes and tried to process what he was hearing, because he knew that rescuing the pet of an imperial princess would have consequences far beyond anything he had imagined. "She wants Leo back," Commander Morgan continued, her voice flat and professional, even though her eyes showed sympathy for Jake's situation. "The Valorian ambassador contacted us this morning with a formal demand for the return of her property, and he made it very clear that refusal would be considered a diplomatic incident of the highest order." Jake stood up so quickly that his chair fell over behind him. "Her property," he repeated, and his voice was louder than he intended it to be. "She chained that animal and threw him into the ocean to drown, and now she wants him back, like nothing happened." Commander Morgan held up her hands in a calming gesture. "I know how you feel, Jake. Believe me, I do. But we need to think carefully about how we handle this situation, because the consequences could affect every human in Valorian space." Jake paced back and forth across the small office, his mind racing as he tried to find some way out of this impossible situation. He thought about Leo, waiting for him outside, trusting and loyal, and completely unaware that the person who had tried to kill him wanted him back. He thought about what would happen to that beautiful creature if he was returned to someone who viewed him as nothing more than a disposable toy to be thrown away when he became inconvenient. And he thought about what kind of person he would become if he handed over an innocent animal to its abuser, just because that abuser happened to be powerful. "I will not give him back," Jake said finally, and his voice was steady, even though his heart was pounding. Commander Morgan looked at him for a long moment before responding. "I was hoping you would say that, because I have been doing some research, and I think there might be a way to protect both Leo and you." She pulled up another file on her computer and showed Jake something that made his heart leap with hope. It was a section of the treaty between humanity and the Valorian Empire, specifically the part that dealt with the legal status of the joint outposts scattered throughout Valorian territory. According to this treaty, these outposts are technically human territory and are governed by human law, Commander Morgan explained with a slight smile. And under human law, animals rescued from situations of abuse cannot be returned to their abusers, regardless of who those abusers might be. Jake stared at her in amazement. You mean we can actually keep Leo legally? The commander nodded, but her expression remained serious. We can try, but I want you to understand what we are up against here, because Princess Selvira is not going to accept this quietly, and neither is her father. She stood up and walked to the window, looking out at the alien landscape beyond. To the Valorians, animals are property, nothing more and nothing less, and the concept of animal cruelty simply does not exist in their legal system or their culture. They view creatures like Leo the same way we might view a piece of furniture, something to be used and discarded when it is no longer wanted. And they genuinely cannot understand why we would care about the welfare of what they consider an object. Jake shook his head in disgust. That is barbaric. That is alien, Commander Morgan corrected him gently. Different species have different values, and we cannot expect everyone in the galaxy to share our views on the rights of animals. She turned to face Jake directly. But that does not mean we have to compromise our own values just because others disagree with them. And I believe that how we treat creatures who cannot speak for themselves says everything about who we are as a species. Jake felt a surge of gratitude toward his commanding officer. So what do we do now? Commander Morgan smiled grimly. Now we prepare for the storm that is coming, because Princess Selvira will be here within the hour to demand her property in person. And she is not going to be happy when she finds out that a human soldier has decided to tell her no. Jake straightened his uniform and squared his shoulders. Then I had better go make sure Leo knows that everything is going to be okay. He walked out of the office and found Leo waiting exactly where he had left him. And the Korath bounded over to greet Jake with a joyful rumble that vibrated through the floor. Jake knelt down and wrapped his arms around the creature's neck, burying his face in that soft blue fur. I promise I will protect you, he whispered, and Leo pressed against him as if he understood every word. Outpost walls. A Valorian shuttle was descending from the sky, carrying a princess who had never been told no in her entire life. But she was about to learn that some things in the galaxy were more valuable than power, and some bonds could not be broken by royal decree. The Valorian shuttle touched down in the courtyard of the human outpost with a sound like thunder, its golden hull gleaming in the afternoon sun as the engines powered down and the boarding ramp extended. Jake stood in the doorway of the medical bay, where Leo was resting, his arms crossed over his chest, and his face set in an expression of calm determination that hid the storm of emotions raging inside him. He watched as Princess Selvira descended from her shuttle, surrounded by a dozen guards in ceremonial armor who carried weapons that hummed with deadly energy. She was beautiful in the way that a poisonous flower is beautiful, with purple skin that shimmered like silk and silver hair that flowed down her back like a waterfall. And she moved with the absolute confidence of someone who had never known defeat. Her guards spread out across the courtyard as she approached the medical bay, their eyes scanning for threats, even though they clearly did not expect to find any. Find any resistance from the primitive humans. Jake did not move from his position in the doorway. Princess Selvira stopped a few meters away and looked him up and down with an expression of contempt that she did not bother to hide. You are the one who stole my property, she said, and her voice was cold and sharp, like a blade made of ice. Jake met her gaze without flinching. I did not steal anything, Your Highness. I rescued a drowning animal from the sea. The princess laughed, a harsh sound that held no warmth or humor. Rescued, what a charming word you humans use, but it changes nothing, because that creature belongs to me and I have come to take it back. She gestured impatiently toward the medical bay. Bring me the Korath immediately, and I may be willing to overlook this insult to my honor. Jake remained exactly where he was. No. The single word hung in the air between them, and for a moment the princess seemed unable to process what she had just heard. Her guards shifted uneasily, their hands moving toward their weapons as they sensed the sudden tension that crackled through the courtyard, like electricity before a storm. "What did you say to me?" Princess Selvyra demanded, and her voice had dropped to a dangerous whisper. "I said no," Jake repeated calmly. "Leo stays with me." The princess stared at him as if he had suddenly grown a second head. "Do you have any idea who I am, little human? I am the daughter of the High Emperor himself, and my word is law in 100 star systems." She stepped closer to Jake, close enough that he could smell the exotic perfume she wore, and see the fury burning in her violet eyes. "I could have you executed with a snap of my fingers, and no one in this pathetic outpost could stop me." Behind Jake, a door opened, and Commander Morgan stepped out, with 4 human soldiers at her back, all of them carrying weapons that were not as elegant as the Valorian Guard's equipment, but just as deadly. "Actually, Your Highness, this outpost is human territory under the terms of our treaty," the commander said, in a voice that was perfectly polite and absolutely unyielding. And under human law, Sergeant Callahan's actions were not only legal, but commendable. Princess Selvyra turned her glare on the commander. "I do not care about your primitive laws. That Koroth is my property, and I demand its return." "I am afraid that will not be possible," Commander Morgan replied. "Under human law, animals rescued from abusive situations cannot be returned to their abusers." The princess's face contorted with rage. "Abusive? How dare you? That creature is nothing but an animal, and I can do whatever I want with my own belongings." Jake stepped forward, unable to contain himself any longer. "He is not a belonging. He is a living creature with feelings and thoughts and a will to survive. And you threw him into the ocean to drown, just because he accidentally scratched you." He pointed at the princess, with a hand that shook slightly with anger. "Where I come from, that makes you a monster, not him." For a moment, Jake thought Princess Selvyra might actually attack him, her hands curling into claws and her eyes blazing with hatred. But then she seemed to collect herself, smoothing her expression into a mask of cold superiority. "You will regret this insult for the rest of your very short life," she hissed. "I will speak to my father about this outrage, and when I am finished, there will not be a single human left in Valorian space." She turned to her guards. "Take the Korath by force." The Valorian guards moved forward in perfect formation, their weapons rising as they advanced toward the medical bay where Leo was hidden. But the human soldiers moved too, placing themselves between the guards and the doorway, with their own weapons raised and ready. Jake felt his heart pounding as the two groups faced each other, knowing that a single wrong move could start a war that would cost countless lives on both sides. "Is this really what you want, Your Highness?" Commander Morgan asked quietly. "To start an armed conflict over a pet that you were willing to murder 3 days ago?" The princess opened her mouth to respond, but the commander was not finished. "Because if your guards take one more step, I will be forced to defend this outpost with lethal force, and then I will release the security footage from your yacht to every news network in human space." She held up a small device that displayed the image of Princess Selvyra throwing Leo into the sea. "I wonder how your father, the Emperor, would react to seeing his daughter become the most hated person in human civilization, and I wonder how your allies in other species would feel about continuing their friendship with someone so cruel." Princess Selvyra went pale, her confidence crumbling as she realized that she had been outmaneuvered. "You would not dare," she whispered, but there was uncertainty in her voice now. "Try me," Commander Morgan replied simply. The standoff lasted for what felt like an eternity, with neither side willing to back down and the fate of two civilizations hanging in the balance. Finally, Princess Selvyra raised her hand and signaled her guards to lower their weapons. "This is not over," she said, and her voice trembled with barely controlled fury. "I will make you pay for this humiliation, all of you." She turned and stalked back toward her shuttle, her guards falling in around her as she went. At the doorway of the shuttle she paused and looked back at Jake with pure hatred burning in her eyes. "Enjoy your stolen pet while you can, human, because I promise you that nothing lasts forever." Gone. The shuttle rising into the sky and disappearing among the clouds as quickly as it had arrived. Jake let out a breath he had not realized he was holding, and felt his legs go weak with relief. Behind him the door to the medical bay opened, and Leo emerged, pressing against Jake's side, and rumbling softly as if to comfort him. Jake knelt down and wrapped his arms around the Korath, holding him close as the tension of the confrontation finally began to fade. "It is okay, boy," he murmured into that soft blue fur. "We won this round." But even as he spoke the words, Jake knew that Commander Morgan was right when she had warned him about the storm that was coming. Princess Selvyra was not the kind of person who accepted defeat gracefully, and she would not rest until she had taken her revenge on the human who had dared to tell her no. The battle for Leo was just beginning. The weeks that followed the confrontation with Princess Selvyra were some of the most turbulent in the history of human and Valorian relations, and Jake found himself at the center of a storm that threatened to tear two civilizations apart. The Valorian Empire issued formal demands for his arrest and extradition, claiming that he had committed theft against the imperial family and must be punished according to their laws. Human diplomats refused these demands, citing the treaty that gave them authority over their own outposts and the laws that protected animals from abusers. Trade negotiations ground to a halt as both sides dug in their positions, and military vessels from both civilizations began gathering near the borders in a show of force that made everyone nervous. But something unexpected happened that neither side had predicted. The story of Jake and Leo spread across the galaxy like wildfire, carried by news networks and social media and word of mouth. From one star system to the next. People of 100 different species watched the footage of a human soldier diving into freezing water to save a drowning animal. And they watched the footage of a spoiled princess throwing that same animal into the sea to die. The contrast was impossible to ignore. Messages of support poured into the human outpost from across known space, with beings of all kinds expressing their admiration for Jake's courage and their disgust at Princess Selvyra's cruelty. The Korath, it turned out, were considered sacred by several species who had been forced into silence by Valorian power, and these species now found their voice as they rallied to humanity's side. Even within the Valorian Empire itself, the story caused ripples that the ruling class had not expected. Common Valorians, who had never questioned their culture's treatment of animals, began to wonder why they had accepted such cruelty as normal. Scholars wrote essays questioning the ethics of viewing living creatures as mere property, and young people organized protests calling for reform. Princess Selvyra, who had expected universal support from her own people, found herself becoming a symbol of everything that was wrong with the aristocracy. Her name became an insult, used by commoners to describe anyone who was cruel and selfish and out of touch with basic decency. Meanwhile, Jake and Leo grew closer with each passing day. The Korath proved to be far more intelligent than anyone had realized, capable of understanding complex commands, and even anticipating Jake's needs before he expressed them. Leo would wake Jake in the morning by gently pressing his cold nose against his hand, and would wait patiently outside the mess hall while Jake ate his meals. When Jake went on patrol, Leo padded silently at his side, alert to every sound and movement in a way that made Jake feel safer than ever. Any weapon ever could. At night, Leo slept at the foot of Jake's bed, his massive body curled up like a house cat, and his golden eyes watching over his human with fierce devotion. The other soldiers at the outpost grew to love Leo as well, playing with him during their off hours and sneaking him treats from the kitchen. Even Commander Morgan, who had initially worried about the complications of having a rare alien animal on base, found herself smiling whenever she saw Jake and Leo together. One evening, she called Jake into her office and shared some remarkable news. Valorian scientists had been studying the bond between humans and Korath for generations, and they had discovered something that explained why Leo was so devoted to Jake. The Korath formed something called a soul bond with their companions, the commander explained, showing Jake research documents on her screen. It is a deep psychological connection that links the animal to the person they have chosen as their protector. Jake frowned in confusion. Their protector? But Princess Selvira owned Leo for weeks before she threw him away. Commander Morgan nodded. That is exactly the point. The bond only forms when the Korath recognizes someone as worthy of their loyalty through an act of selfless sacrifice. She looked at Jake with something like wonder in her eyes. When you jumped into that freezing water and risked your own life to save Leo, you proved yourself in a way that Princess Selvira never could. You showed him that you valued his life more than your own safety, and that created a bond between you that cannot be broken by anything less than death itself. Jake looked down at Leo, who had followed him into the office and was now pressed against his leg as always. The Korath looked back up at him with those golden eyes that held such trust and love, and Jake felt his heart swell with emotion. Is that why he would not leave my side when I was hurt? He asked quietly. A few weeks earlier, Jake had been injured during a training exercise when a piece of equipment malfunctioned and struck him in the head. He had been unconscious for several hours, and during that time Leo had refused to leave his bedside. The Korath had growled at anyone who tried to remove him, including the doctors who needed to treat Jake's wounds, and had only calmed down when Jake finally woke up. Commander Morgan smiled. The scientists say that your pain is his pain, and your joy is his joy, and that he will protect you with his life, if necessary. She paused, and her expression grew serious. Which brings me to the reason I called you here tonight. She pulled up a new file on her screen, this one showing intelligence reports and intercepted communications. Our sources tell us that Princess Selvira has not given up on getting her revenge, and she is planning something that could put you and Leo in serious danger. Jake felt a chill run down his spine. What kind of something? We do not know the details yet, but we have intercepted messages that suggest she is hiring mercenaries and making deals with people outside the law. Commander Morgan's jaw tightened. She does not care about the Korath anymore. This has become personal for her, and she will not stop until she has destroyed you and everything you care about. Jake squared his shoulders and met her gaze with determination. Then we will be ready for her. He reached down and stroked Leo's blue fur, feeling the rumble of the Korath's purr vibrating through his hand. Whatever she throws at us, we will face it together. Commander Morgan stood up and walked around her desk to place a hand on Jake's shoulder. You are not alone in this fight, Jake. Every human on this outpost will stand with you, and so will our allies across the galaxy. Smiled grimly. The princess made a mistake when she chose you as her enemy, because she did not understand that humans do not abandon their own. Jake nodded and turned to leave, but at the doorway he paused and looked back. Commander, do you think we did the right thing? I mean, really, knowing all the trouble it has caused? Commander Morgan did not hesitate. I think that history will remember this moment as the time when humanity showed the galaxy what we stand for, and I think that is worth any amount of trouble. Jake walked out into the night, with Leo at his side, looking up at the alien stars and wondering what challenges awaited them. He did not know what Princess Selvira was planning or how he would face it, but he knew that he had made the right choice when he jumped into that water, and he knew that some bonds were worth fighting for, no matter the cost. The attack came in the darkest hour of the night, when most of the outpost was asleep and the guards were tired from long shifts of watching empty horizons. Jake was dreaming of home when Leo's warning growl jolted him awake, and he had barely enough time to grab his weapon before the first explosion rocked the building. Alarms screamed through the corridors as mercenaries in black armor poured through breaches in the outpost walls, their weapons blazing with energy that tore through metal and flesh alike. Jake scrambled out of his quarters, with Leo at his heels, his heart pounding as he tried to make sense of the chaos unfolding around him. He found Commander Morgan in the command center, shouting orders into their communicator, while screens showed images of attackers overwhelming the outpost defenses. "It is Princess Selvira," she yelled over the noise of battle. She hired a small army of mercenaries to storm this place, and looked at the tactical display. "What do they want?" The commander's face was grim. And that is not even the worst part." She pointed to a screen showing a group of mercenaries cutting their way toward the medical bay where wounded soldiers were being treated. "They do not care who gets hurt. They are killing everyone in their path." Jake made his decision in an instant. "I will draw them away from the civilians. Leo and I will lead them on a chase through the outpost while you organize a counterattack." Commander Morgan grabbed his arm. "That is suicide, Jake. There are too many of them." But Jake was already moving toward the door, with Leo bounding alongside him like a blue shadow. "Just get our people to safety," he called back over his shoulder. "We will handle the rest." The corridors of the outpost had become a battlefield, with fires burning and bodies lying where they had fallen, and the sounds of death. Combat echoing from every direction. Jake moved through the chaos with Leo guiding him, the Korath's keen senses detecting enemies before they could spring their ambushes. Twice they walked into groups of mercenaries, and twice they fought their way through, Jake's weapon blazing, while Leo's claws tore through armor like paper. But the mercenaries were too numerous and too well equipped, and eventually Jake found himself cornered in a storage room with no way out and a dozen enemies closing in. He was wounded now, a deep gash in his side where a blade had slipped past his guard, and he could feel his strength fading as blood soaked through his uniform. Leo stood in front of him, placing his body between Jake and the mercenaries, but even the loyal Korath looked exhausted and battered from the running battle. The mercenary leader stepped forward, a massive figure in scarred black armor, who moved with the confidence of someone who had won 1,000 fights. "Give us the Korath and we will let you live," he growled through his helmet. Jake laughed weakly and raised his weapon with trembling hands. "You can tell your princess that the answer is still no." The mercenary shrugged and raised his own weapon. "Your choice, human." But before he could fire, Leo did something that no one expected. The Korath threw back his head and roared. It was not an ordinary roar, but something far more powerful. A sound that seemed to shake the very foundations of the building and sent waves of force rippling through the air. The mercenaries stumbled backward, clutching their heads as the roar penetrated their helmets and rattled their bones. Windows shattered and lights exploded, and even the walls seemed to tremble as Leo unleashed a power that had been dormant within him since birth. And then Leo attacked. Jake had seen the Korath in action before, but never like this. Terrible fury and devastating power. Leo moved through the mercenaries like a force of nature, his claws flashing and his teeth tearing as he destroyed anyone who dared to threaten his human. The mercenary leader tried to fight back, but Leo was too fast and too strong. Within moments, the massive figure was lying broken on the floor. When it was over, Leo stood alone among the fallen enemies, his blue fur stained with blood, and his golden eyes blazing with protective rage. He turned back to Jake and padded over to his side, nuzzling against him gently, as if to check that he was still alive. Jake wrapped his arms around Leo's neck and held on tight, too exhausted to speak, but overwhelming with gratitude for this magnificent creature who had saved his life. "Good boy," he finally managed to whisper. "You are a very good boy." Reinforcements arrived minutes later, led by Commander Morgan, who had organized a counterattack that swept the remaining mercenaries from the outpost. They found Jake unconscious against the wall, with Leo standing guard over him, growling at anyone who tried to approach, until the commander herself knelt down and showed the Korath her empty hands. The aftermath of the attack changed everything. Evidence recovered from the mercenaries traced the assault directly to Princess Elvira, revealing a conspiracy so brazen that even her father, the Emperor, could not ignore it. She had ordered an attack on a diplomatic outpost and the murder of innocent people, all to satisfy her wounded pride and punish a human who had dared to tell her no. The scandal that followed shook the Valorian Empire to its foundations. Princess Elvira was stripped of her title and exiled to a distant colony world, her name erased from the imperial records as if she had never existed. But more importantly, the Emperor himself came to visit the human outpost in the weeks that followed. The footage of Leo defending Jake, and he had seen the bond between human and Korath that transcended species and culture. In a ceremony broadcast across the galaxy, the Emperor formally recognized Leo as Jake's companion under a new legal framework that granted Korath and other intelligent animals rights they had never possessed before. It was the first step toward animal protection laws that would eventually transform Valorian society. Laws inspired by the example of a human soldier who refused to abandon a creature in need. Jake became a hero to billions of beings across known space, but he never saw himself that way. When reporters asked him why he had risked everything for an alien animal, he would just shrug and smile. "My grandfather back on Earth always told me that you can judge a man by how he treats his dog," he would say. I figured the same rule applies to lions. Years later, when Jake finally retired from military service, he returned to Earth with Leo at his side. They settled on a ranch in the mountains, where Leo could run free under open skies, chasing birds and rolling in the grass like an oversized house cat. Sometimes, visitors would come from across the galaxy to meet the famous pair, expecting grand stories of adventure and heroism. What they found was a gray-haired man throwing a ball for a massive blue lion, both of them looking completely at peace with the universe. When asked about his legacy, Jake would just scratch Leo behind his ears and watch the sunset. "Some bonds do not need words to explain," he would say quietly. "They just need someone willing to jump into cold water when it matters." And Leo would press against his side and purr, content in the knowledge that he had found the one person in all the galaxy who truly saw him as family. That was all either of them had ever wanted.